The morning the door closed for the last time, the air held the clean, sharp scent of pine and coming frost. Hannah stood on the porch, her hands empty at her sides. The wood beneath her feet was the same she had helped plane and set, its grain as familiar as a map of her own life. Inside, Thomas was a silhouette against the light of the main room. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. His quiet pronouncements carried the weight of stone. He slid a small canvas sack across the threshold. The clink of a few coins was a paltry, insulting sound in the vast silence of the valley. "Go back to your mother," he said. The words were not a suggestion. They were the final turn of a key in a lock. He looked past her, at the field she had helped clear, at the fence line she had painstakingly walked and mended. This land needs heirs. It needs sons. The true reason came then, a barb twisted in the wound of her barrenness. Your ideas are as fruitless as your womb. Strange notions and holes in the ground. He was referring to her sketches of a root cellar, one dug deep into the hillside to keep produce from freezing or rotting. He had laughed at them. Now, his laughter had curdled into this final, cold dismissal. Kaiser, her German shepherd, pressed against her leg, a low whine vibrating in his chest. He was the only thing in this world, besides the clothes on her back, that was still hers. She did not argue. She did not plead. The time for that had passed in 1,000 small surrenders over the years. She bent, picked up the sack, and turned her back on the house. She did not look back. To look back would be to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She walked down the path, the dust rising in small puffs around her worn boots, Kaiser trotting faithfully at her heel. The weight in the sack was nothing. The weight in her chest was everything. The walk to her mother's plot was a journey through a landscape of failure. Every familiar landmark, the crooked oak, the dry creek bed, the distant spire of the town church, seemed to mock her return. She was a ship with a broken mast, limping back to a port that had never been safe. Her mother, Martha, lived in a small, weathered cabin at the very edge of town, on a parcel of land too rocky to farm and too steep to build on properly. It was a place for endings. Martha met her at the door, her face a mask of worn patience. She was a small, bird-like woman, her hands gnarled by work and age, but her eyes held a fierce, unbroken clarity. She looked at Hannah, at the dog, at the pathetic sack in her daughter's hand, and seemed to absorb the entire story in a single, silent breath. She stepped aside, holding the door open. He was always a small man, Hannah, was all she said. There was no pity in her voice, only a flat statement of fact, an assessment she had likely made years ago and kept to herself. The cabin was clean but threadbare, the air thin and cold. They had little. A few preserved vegetables in jars, a half sack of flour, and the meager income Martha earned from mending clothes for the townsfolk. The coming winter loomed not as a season, but as an adversary. Days later, while searching for fallen branches on the scrubby hillside behind the cabin, Hannah felt a familiar stirring of the curiosity Thomas had so despised. Kaiser, chasing after a rabbit, disappeared into a thicket of overgrown buckthorn. When he did not immediately return, Hannah pushed through the thorny branches to find him sniffing at a dark fissure in the rock face, his tail giving a low, uncertain wag. A steady, cool current of air flowed from the opening, smelling not of damp or decay, but of deep earth, of stone and stillness. It was a clean, ancient smell. She placed her palm near the opening and felt the air, consistent and unhurried. It was a breath. The hill was breathing. A strange and stubborn idea, one of her fruitless notions, began to take root in the barren soil of her mind. The next morning, she returned with a lantern and a length of rope tied around her waist, the other end secured to a sturdy pinyon pine. Martha had watched her go, her expression unreadable, asking no questions. Trust, in her mother's world, was a silent thing. Hannah squeezed through the narrow opening, the rough stone scraping her coat. After a few feet, the passage widened, and she could stand. She lifted the lantern. The light bloomed, pushing back an immense and patient darkness. She was standing at the edge of a great cavern, larger than any church she had ever seen. The ceiling soared into blackness far above her head, and the far walls were lost in shadow. The floor was not smooth, but a series of wide, natural terraces of stone that stepped down into the heart of the hill. She walked forward slowly, the sound of her boots a small, solitary echo. The air was utterly still. She held up the lantern, its flame a perfect, unwavering teardrop. There were no drafts, no gusts of wind, only the slow, imperceptible exchange of air with the outside world that kept it from becoming stale. It was not cold like a cellar, nor warm like a room. It simply was. It held a temperature that felt eternal, a deep, abiding neutrality born of the tons of rock and earth that insulated it from the frantic seasonal shifts of the world above. She spent hours inside, walking its perimeter, studying the dry, solid walls, looking for signs of water seepage and finding none. She saw a natural fissure high in the ceiling, a faint hint of daylight filtering through it, a perfect chimney. She did not see a cave. She saw a fortress. She saw shelter, not just from the wind and snow, but from the scorn of the world. It was a place where the winter could rage and it would not matter. A place where a life could be built, hidden and safe. She returned to the cabin as dusk was falling, her clothes covered in dust, her face calm. Martha was sitting by the fire. Hannah met her gaze across the small room. "I found a place," she said. "A foundation." The work was a kind of prayer offered to the gods of gravity and leverage. They began by dismantling the old cabin, the one that stood as a monument to Martha's widowhood and poverty. Hannah worked the pry bar, her muscles straining as she eased the old, seasoned planks free. Each nail pulled from the wood shrieked in protest. Martha, with her surprisingly strong hands, would catch the boards, stacking them with a neatness that defied the chaos of their task. They were not just taking apart a building, they were harvesting its bones. Hauling the lumber up the steep incline to the cave mouth was the hardest part. They used the rope and Kaiser's powerful shoulders, the dog leaning into a makeshift harness, his paws digging into the loose shale. They moved one beam, one plank at a time. It was a slow, punishing rhythm that measured the days. The town, what little of it noticed them, saw only two mad women, one old and one abandoned, tearing down the only shelter they had. They could not see the purpose, only the destruction. Inside the vast, quiet space of the cavern, the building began anew. On the widest, most level stone terrace, well back from the entrance, Hannah laid out the foundation beams. She chose the spot with care, a place that would catch the morning light from the entrance but was protected from the direct flow of air. She built a small, tight, one-room cabin, its walls not touching the stone of the cave. She left a gap of 2 feet all around, an insulating layer of still, cavern air. Daniel, the carpenter who would arrive a year later, would call it a thermal envelope, a term of science that perfectly described the instinct she was following. With Martha's guidance on the joinery, they raised the walls and set the roof beams. They reassembled their home inside the belly of the hill. Through the natural fissure in the ceiling, Hannah painstakingly built a flue from flat stones and clay, a chimney that would draw the smoke from their small cast-iron stove and vent it invisibly out of the high, rocky face of the hill. Outside, in the small patch of sun near the entrance, she tilled the thin, rocky soil, enriching it with leaf mold and waste from their small latrine. She planted the seeds of stubborn things, carrots, turnips, potatoes, and thick-leaved cabbages. Things that grew down into the earth, hoarding their sweetness against the coming cold. The labor was all-consuming. It scoured her mind of the past, leaving only the immediate reality of a hammer's weight, the scent of sawdust, and the deep, satisfying ache in her bones at the end of each day. The whispers in town started as a trickle and soon became a steady current of derision. The story, embellished with each telling, was that Hannah Thorne, driven mad by her husband's rejection, had taken her poor mother to live in a hole like an animal. Mr. Hemlock, the proprietor of the general store, became the town's primary narrator of her folly. He was a man whose own comfort was built on the small misfortunes of others, a failed crop that forced a farmer to buy on credit, a harsh winter that drove up the price of flour. Hannah's strange project was a source of great amusement to him. When she came in to buy nails and a small sack of beans, he leaned on the counter, a smirk playing on his lips. "Getting the den all cozy for winter, Hannah?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the other customers to hear. A few men chuckled into their hands. Hannah finished counting her coins and pushed them across the worn wood. She looked directly into his eyes, her gaze level and calm. "It will be warm," she said. "And it will be safe." Her refusal to be baited, her simple, unadorned dignity, was more infuriating to him than any angry retort. It denied him his sport. She turned and left, the bell above the door announcing her departure into a silence thick with judgment. Thomas, her former husband, heard the tales and felt a vindication that soothed the raw edges of his pride. He had been right about her. She was strange, impractical, unfit to be the wife of a man of property. He told his friends at the saloon that he had seen it coming for years, her obsession with dirt and rocks. He was building a second barn, a monument to his prosperity, and felt secure in the sound, sensible world of right angles and solid foundations. The town's mockery built a wall around Hannah and Martha, an isolation more profound than the stone of the hillside. They were pariahs, figures of pity and scorn. But inside their growing fortress, the opinions of the world above ceased to matter. The work was the only truth. The steady temperature of the cave was the only certainty. One afternoon in late autumn, as the aspens on the high ridges turned a brilliant, trembling gold, a stranger rode into town. He was an Englishman, dressed in practical but well-made clothes, and he carried himself with an air of quiet authority. His name was Alastair Finch, a geologist and engineer surveying a potential route for the railroad. He was a man of science, more interested in rock strata and water tables than in local gossip, but even he could not escape the story of the two women living in a cave. The tale was told to him as a quaint, sad piece of local folklore. But Mr. Finch's mind, trained to see the logic hidden within landscapes, was intrigued. There were geologic formations, limestone karst, lava tubes, that could create stable, dry subterranean spaces. He decided to see for himself. He found Hannah not in a hole, but in a thriving terraced garden carved into the hillside just outside the cave mouth. Rows of hardy greens shone in the crisp sunlight. She was on her knees, carefully banking earth around the base of her cabbages. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary, her hands covered in soil. He dismounted, introducing himself with formal politeness, explaining his work in the region. He asked if the stories were true, not with the leering curiosity of the townsfolk, but with the genuine interest of a fellow student of the earth. Hannah studied him for a long moment, then nodded and rose to her feet. She led him inside. Mr. Finch stopped just inside the entrance, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He saw the neatly constructed cabin, the organized stacks of firewood, the shelves of preserved goods. He saw not madness, but profound and startling ingenuity. He pulled a thermometer from his satchel, his movements precise. He measured the temperature outside, then just inside the cave mouth, then beside the cabin itself. He noted the 15-degree difference, the remarkable stability. He examined the stone flue, tapping it with his knuckles. He understood its function instantly. He turned to Hannah, his face lit with an expression of pure, intellectual delight. "Madam," he said, his voice filled with a respect that was utterly foreign to her ears. "This is not a burrow. This is a marvel of passive geothermal design. You have, by instinct and observation, created a dwelling of near-perfect thermal efficiency." He spoke with the passion of a man discovering a new scientific principle. For Hannah, it was the first time someone had looked at her work and seen not folly, but genius. Daniel arrived with the first snows of the year, a quiet man leading a tired horse. He was a carpenter by trade, a widower whose small homestead 2 valleys over had been erased by a prairie fire that had taken everything but his tools and his life. He came to town seeking work, any work, to get him through the winter. He heard the town's talk of Hannah, the same dismissive stories, but he had also been in the saloon the night Alastair Finch had, before departing, described Hannah's home to a rapt audience as a triumph of practical engineering. Finch's words carried the weight of education and authority, and they had planted a seed of doubt in the town's comfortable narrative. Daniel, a man who understood the properties of wood and the challenges of a harsh climate, was more inclined to believe the engineer than the gossips. He sought her out, not as a curiosity, but as a fellow builder. He found her splitting firewood, the movements of the axe clean and efficient. He didn't offer charity. He offered a trade. His skill with a saw and hammer in exchange for shelter and a share of her winter stores. "I can make that door seal tighter," he said, looking at the entrance to her cabin. "And build shelves that will hold a proper weight." Hannah looked at his hands. They were a carpenter's hands, strong and capable, with calluses in the right places. She saw the grief in his eyes, a quiet sorrow that mirrored her own. She saw no judgment, only a deep, weary pragmatism. "There is wood stacked by the south wall," she said, a simple statement of acceptance. They worked together in the quiet companionship of shared purpose. He built sturdy shelves that lined the cabin walls, a new table and benches, and a perfectly fitted door that closed without a whisper of a draft. He spoke little, but his actions were a conversation. He admired the way she had vented the stove, she respected the precision of his dovetail joints. One evening, sitting by the fire while Martha dozed in her chair, he looked around the warm, secure room. "You don't just see the wood," he said, his voice low. "You see the way the land breathes." In that moment, a connection was forged, stronger than any nail or joint. It was a partnership built not on romance, but on a foundation of mutual, hard-won respect. The winter of that year was not a season, it was a judgment. It came early and stayed late, a relentless siege of snow and wind. The old-timers called it a wolf winter, a season with teeth. A blizzard descended upon the high plains and did not lift for 3 weeks. The world vanished into a churning vortex of white. The wind, a living thing, scoured the land, piling drifts as high as rooftops and finding every crack and seam in the town's defenses. In the valley, people huddled in their homes, feeding their stoves constantly, watching their precious woodpiles shrink with alarming speed. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through floorboards and walls, turning water to ice in buckets just feet from the fire. Livestock, caught in the open, froze where they stood. The town became an archipelago of isolated, shivering households. Thomas, in his fine, sturdy house, felt the cold for the first time. The wind howled around the eaves of his impressive new barn, and he stuffed rags around the rattling window frames of the home he had once shared with Hannah. His wood supply, which had seemed immense, was dwindling. Fear, an emotion he rarely felt, began to prick at the edges of his confidence. But in the heart of the hill, the world was different. The blizzard was a distant, muted roar, the sound of a faraway ocean. Inside the cave, the temperature remained constant, cool but not cold. Inside their small wooden cabin, the little stove glowed, its warmth contained and amplified by the layers of wood and air and stone. It required surprisingly little fuel. They were warm. They were safe. Their shelves were laden with jars of preserves, sacks of potatoes and turnips rested in the cool outer cavern, and smoked venison hung from the rafters. Life fell into a gentle, quiet rhythm. Martha knitted by the light of the lantern. Daniel mended a harness. Hannah read from a book Mr. Finch had left her, a geology text whose diagrams of thermal vents and rock formations now made perfect sense. Kaiser slept at her feet, his flank rising and falling in the peaceful sleep of a creature utterly secure. They were not enduring the winter. They were living in its heart, untouched. A break in the storm came on the 23rd day. The wind died, and a pale, watery sun revealed a landscape transformed, buried under a deep and unforgiving blanket of white. The town was in crisis. Fuel was low, food was running out, and sickness was spreading. The wife of the town doctor, a woman named Agnes, was shivering with a fever that would not break. Their own house was an icebox, and the doctor knew she would not last another night. Desperate, his mind latched onto the memory of the English geologist's words the whole town had dismissed as the eccentric ramblings of an outsider. He wrapped himself in every layer he owned and began the grueling trek through the massive drifts toward Hannah's hillside. It took him 2 hours to cover a distance he could normally walk in 20 minutes. He arrived exhausted, his beard encrusted with ice, and found a scene of impossible normalcy. A thin plume of smoke rose placidly from the hidden chimney. Daniel was outside, clearing a path, his movements strong and unhurried. The doctor stumbled toward him, half sobbing with cold and desperation. Daniel led him inside the cave. The shift in temperature was so profound it made him dizzy. He was brought into the small cabin, into a pocket of warmth and light that felt like a different world. He saw Hannah, her mother, and the dog, all calm and well-fed. The shame was a physical blow. He, a man of science and standing, was freezing to death while the woman they had all scorned as a fool was living in quiet comfort. He explained about his wife, about the sick children, his words tumbling out in a rush of shame and fear. He asked if she could take them in. He was prepared to beg. He was prepared to be refused. Hannah looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she glanced at Daniel, who gave a slow, deliberate nod. She turned back to the doctor. "Bring them," she said. It was not a question or a negotiation. It was a simple, quiet command. That afternoon, a small, sad procession made its way to the cave, carrying the sick and the shivering. They were brought into the warmth, wrapped in blankets, and given bowls of hot turnip stew. Mr. Hemlock, his own grandson burning with fever, could not meet Hannah's eyes as she took the boy from his arms. He saw the shelves laden with food, the evidence of a foresight he had openly mocked, and the full weight of his own foolishness settled upon him. Hannah said nothing. She simply served. When the final thaw came and spring returned to the valley, it was a different world. The town had survived, but it was humbled. The wolf winter had stripped away its pride and its certainties, leaving a raw and quiet gratitude. The story of Hannah's cave was no longer a subject of ridicule, it was spoken of in hushed, respectful tones. It had become the ark that had carried the town's most vulnerable through the flood. No one offered a formal apology, that was not the way of these people, but the respect was real and deep. It was in the way Mr. Hemlock now tipped his hat when she entered the store, in the extra measure of flour he gave her, in the averted eyes of the women who had once whispered behind their hands. Thomas's story had a different ending. The winter had broken him. He had lost most of his livestock, his new barn had been damaged by the wind, and the fields he had prized so highly were flooded with meltwater. He had faced the crisis alone, isolated by the very pride that had led him to cast Hannah out. That summer, he sold the farm for a fraction of its worth and moved west, disappearing into the territories, a small man swallowed by a vast landscape. Hannah and Daniel were married by the traveling preacher that autumn, in a simple ceremony held at the mouth of the cave. The whole town attended. They did not stay in the cave forever, but it remained the heart of their homestead. They built a small house nearby for the warmer months, but every winter, they moved back into the deep, quiet warmth of the hill. They expanded the gardens, their knowledge of the land growing with each season. The cave became a place of learning, a living example of how to live with the land instead of fighting it. Other families, inspired by their example, began to dig their own deep cellars and shelters, forever changing the way the community prepared for winter. Hannah's strange notions had become the town's common sense. Years passed like the turning of pages in a well-read book. Hannah grew old, her hair the color of winter snow, her hands a testament to a life of work and care. She and Daniel raised 3 children, who grew up with the rhythms of the cave, understanding the steady breath of the earth as a fundamental truth of their world. They filled notebooks with observations, records of temperature, of rainfall, of when the first frost arrived and the last one departed. They created a library of practical knowledge, an inheritance far more valuable than land or coin. One late summer afternoon, Hannah, now a great-grandmother, sat on a wooden bench just inside the cave entrance with her youngest granddaughter. The child, small and curious, held her hand up to the opening. "It's breathing, Grandma," she whispered, her eyes wide. Hannah smiled, a slow, deep smile that held the memory of 1,000 seasons. "Yes," she said. "It always has." The air that flowed out over them was cool and constant, carrying the same ancient scent of stone and stillness she remembered from that first day. She looked out at the valley, at the prosperous town, at the fields green with late crops. The world beyond the cave had changed beyond recognition. But here, in the heart of the hill that had sheltered her, the temperature still held. The work was done. The legacy was safe. It was a quiet triumph, written not in history books, but in the steady, enduring warmth of the earth itself.